everybody. I'm Anna. I'm going to be taking us through an article about animal aggression and specifically how we can link androgens and androgenic hormones such as testosterone with social competition. The article really focuses on studies that have already been conducted on animals, and we're going to discuss whether we can or cannot use these studies to possibly describe behaviors in humans as well. So let's dive in. Give you a brief overview of this study. This research article discusses various different studies, and by that I mean it is a review of different studies that have already been conducted. It is not an experiment in and of itself. So in this presentation, it might be a little different than some of the ones that we've had in the past in this class. It's not really going to go through the methods and results and things like that like we might be used to in a research study, because this isn't a research experiment. However, this review does explore how animal research has the potential for parallels in humans. Things that we really need to make sure that we understand before we get going in this article is what androgens really are. So let's get a little background first. Androgens are simply a group of hormones that are found in males and females, but these hormones are the ones that specifically work together to create the more male characteristics. So when we talk about aggressive behaviors, we can conclude that these come from a lot of the testosterone and different androgenic hormones that are in our bodies. However, like I said, they are present in females and males. And like I just discussed, a common example of androgens is testosterone, and that's what's going to be primarily discussed in this article as we look through it together. So androgens can influence aggressive and competitive behaviors, and that's really what we're going to be looking into through this research in animals. One of the other things that we really might be curious about is why would somebody do this study? Because as I mentioned, it's not a research experiment. We're looking at research that has already been conducted and seeing how we might be able to apply it to humans. And so as students, we might wonder why this would be important. So overall, androgens' relationships with aggression is studied in humans frequently because we're really curious about human nature and about what different types of hormones and what things might lead up to aggressive behaviors in humans. But when we are talking about human research experiments, we're inevitably going to be faced with limitations because we have to follow all ethical guidelines clearly, and some tests on hormones and trying to manipulate hormones would be called into question of ethics, and probably would not make it past very many IRBs if we were to try to conduct this study in humans. So when we can't conduct the studies that we want to on humans, but we want to have the information, we can use animal research to find parallels and different comparisons we can have when the human studies are limited. And that's the case in this study. That's why this review was created, was because it's information that we want about humans, but we can't necessarily directly experiment and manipulate people's hormones. Mentioned earlier, everyone has their own baseline level of testosterone. Males, females, everyone has testosterone in their bodies. That is just a baseline level. And so what we really want to focus on in this research in looking at this article is things like the challenge hypothesis, which I'm about to dive into. These things come up when levels of testosterone change. So we each have our baseline levels, but when the baseline of testosterone baseline level is low, it can rapidly increase during aggressive interactions. And in this study, they focus a lot on rodents, California rodents, and when faced with something aggressive, when they have to be combative and things like that, they can see right after the fact that these levels of testosterone have increased within 30 or 45 minutes of the encounter. And this has to do with what transient testosterone level we have. So we all have a baseline, and then we all have like this transient testosterone level that changes depending on whether we're in a relaxed state or we're in an aggressive interaction, things like that. So basically, what the researchers found in looking over these articles is that testosterone finds its peak shortly after an animal wins an aggressive situation. So if we want to think about humans, even if we don't want to think about necessarily maybe being aggressive, but we want to think about a win, if we're playing a sports game and we win it and it was a really close game and it was pretty, maybe it was aggressive or it was just neck and neck for a while and then we finally pull out a win, then after that we might feel more charged up, ready to go, and that could be possibly a way that we can tell that our testosterone is peaking after these wins. And that's what they found in the rodents that they were studying, is after one of these rodents would win an aggressive situation, 30, 45 minutes, possibly even an hour later, the testosterone in these rodents would peak. So it would rise up from their baseline level to this new level, which would be what we would refer to as the transient testosterone level. Most things, though, the context of the aggressive situation is very important. So it's not just so cut and dry. It's not any aggressive situation. If you win it, your testosterone will peak. That's not the case. So let's look at a few different examples of that from the literature review. They looked at a song sparrow study, and what they found through research on song sparrows is that the testosterone influences their aggression during the mating season, which for them is in the summer, but not during the other times of the year. So the other times of the year, they might get aggressive, but not have rising levels of testosterone and things like that. And so what we really want to remember is that it's not just one size fits all. We can't just make a blanket statement of if you win an aggressive situation, then your testosterone will rise, or vice versa. We can't really make that statement just across the board. And quickly, another example is there was a study referenced about fish and then a separate one about whales. And after they fought or they had a fighting situation, an aggressive encounter with a different fish or a different quail, respectively, then they did have a spike in testosterone, but then they were replaced. The other fish and the other quail were replaced with a mirror. And so they ended up having to fight themselves. And after they did become aggressive with themselves, but after they finished, even though hypothetically they won the encounter against themselves in the mirror, but after that encounter, their testosterone didn't spike like it did after they fought a different fish or a different bird. And then there was another example of how context is important with mice. So what they discussed was that if a mouse had 3 wins in their own cage, they had the home field advantage, they won 3 aggressive encounters in their cage, then they produced what was called the winner effect. And so that was a great increase in testosterone after the fact and an increase in future aggressive behaviors because they felt confident, I assume, and they stood their ground and they protected their home. However, if you look at the other side, which I didn't put all the details on the slide, but if you look at the mice who had 3 separate wins in 3 separate cages, they didn't experience this winner effect. They didn't have the same spike in testosterone as the ones who won 3 different challenges in their own cage. And so we can see through these different studies and these different experiments that the context really is important, and that's why we can't just truly give a blanket statement of if you win, testosterone will increase, and we can't estimate how much because it really depends on the situation. is just that last example of the mouse winning when it's in its own cage versus when it's not. So if we look at the mouse and we go up, follow the blue arrow, they won a territorial fight. Then they have a post-victory increase in their testosterone, which increases their brain levels of these different hormones that we see here in their brain, which then increases their motivation to be aggressive, and they're just super vigilant. They're watchful. They don't want something or someone to invade their space. And then they have the winner effect that's formed because then more victories increase testosterone even more. But if we follow the other blue line, if we follow the one that points down, then we see that they won a non-territorial encounter. So they won an aggressive encounter, but it wasn't in their home cage. They don't really have a change in their testosterone level. And so there's not really so many changes in their brain or in the neurons in their brain. And if there's not really any neural changes, then there's not really any changes in aggressive behavior, and there's also consequently no winner effect. And so that doesn't become a cycle. But if they're winning in their own cage, as we said in that context, then they have the more of the potential to form this winner effect and have more potential to increase their aggressive behaviors in the future. And that's another just graphical example of how the context really does matter, because if we win a territorial fight, we end up with this cycle. And if we win a non-territorial fight, then we win it, but there's no cycle. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to repeat back. And so how the fight is won, where the fight is won, things like that, even just for a mouse, it matters. And so that's just what this graph really illustrates if you saw that in the article. Another thing that we talk about a lot in psychology is reinforcement. It's a topic near and dear to our heart. In this article, one of the things that they really point out is that testosterone itself can be used as a reinforcer. So they address these different operant conditioning scenarios. And in some of these operant conditioning situations, we have animals that are voluntarily administering testosterone to themselves, which kind of proves to us, since they've been conditioned operantly, that if this is something they're willing to voluntarily administer to themselves, then it's something that they want. It's something that truly is reinforcing to them. So we can see that when there is a social victory, this social victory helps release more of this testosterone into the body. This can also make aggression more appealing because they truly want the flow of testosterone in their body. This feeling of having more testosterone is rewarding to them, as seen by animals choosing to administer testosterone into their bodies. And so this kind of also explains how like the graph we just looked at together, when there was that increase in testosterone, we saw the cycle continued all the way, and there likely was an increase in aggressive behaviors. And this could be why, because if they have that aggressive behaviors, they win the fight or the aggressive encounter, then the testosterone gets released throughout their body, and they like that feeling, and so they will do what it takes to make that feeling come back again. So that's one of the things that we have to keep in mind. They looked at it in the studies of animals, and maybe we could look at that in studies of humans and kind of just track that behavior and see if that's something we think could parallel as well. Things that the article also addresses that there's less research about currently is testosterone increasing before an aggressive encounter. A lot of the studies that are addressed in the research article for this week have to do with testosterone increasing as a result of an aggressive encounter, but there's also potential for testosterone to increase before the aggression ever occurs. Some fish studies were conducted, and they were referenced in the article. And when these fish are conditioned to anticipate that there will be aggression, their testosterone levels increase before the aggression ever occurs. So, I mean, If I think about it personally, I think that this makes a lot of sense for humans as well. Like if we're on edge, if we're really vigilant, if we're really thinking like something bad or something aggressive is about to happen, I think we in that more maybe that more fight instead of flight mode, then that makes sense that testosterone levels would at that point be increased, even though no action has happened yet. Like I said, though, there's not that much information about this, so this is something that could be studied more. Possibly one of the limitations of this research article is not having that information. And then one of the things that the article really mentions about testosterone increasing before aggression is that you can't really tell like which comes first. You can't definitely identify a causal relationship. And this has to do with the theory of the mind. And the theory of the mind just says that we at that point would be attributing our state of mind to another person, or the fish would be attributing its state of mind to another fish, things like that. And there's not a lot of empirical evidence that we can have to really support that, but there is potential for more research in that area as well. We wrap up, let's just discuss briefly the conclusions of this article. Like I said, there's not really a conclusion as far as the results that were reached, because this wasn't an experimental study. However, there are still conclusions to be made in literature reviews such as this one. And one of the really important parts of this study was that testosterone can be very important as a reinforcer. And I think it's important that we understand that testosterone has that potential. It has the potential to be a reinforcer to people or animals. That was really highlighted in the text. A lot of observations between rodents and humans are consistent in different studies, in drug studies even. Different types of experimental studies find that there is a lot of correlation between what happens in a rodent's body and what happens in a human's body. So a case can be made for applying these theories that are discussed in this article to humans, even though the research that's being discussed wasn't done on humans. So one of the other things that was really important in this text was the winner effect. And there's plenty of potential to do more research on that cycle and how that's created, maybe different contexts that's more likely to be created. But the winner effect, remember, was when you win an aggressive encounter, are you more likely to become aggressive in the future? However, as far as directly relating these principles to humans, there's definitely more research necessary before we could just say that everything in this study should be applied to humans. Because it wasn't done on humans. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of ethical ramifications of trying to manipulate someone's hormones and things like that. And so we do the best we can with what we have, and that's what these researchers have done. But I do hope that there's more research conducted on animals like this in the future, so maybe we could have a more direct correlation and understand better what the human side of things are. So that's what I have for this. The article is linked here, and have a great day. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation about androgens.